It arrived in November 1964, a nondescript package sitting quietly on the front porch of a family home in Atlanta. When Coretta peeled back the brown paper, she didn't tremble. She simply expected a recording of her husband's speeches, perhaps another tribute to a man who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize. But when she pressed play, the room didn't fill with the sound of hope or applause. It filled with something dark, intimate, and violating. And buried beside the tape was a single, typed letter. It contained no return address, no signature, and no mercy. It didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for silence. It commanded a suicide. "There is only one thing left for you to do," the letter warned. This was not the work of a criminal syndicate or a lone stalker hiding in the shadows. The fingerprints on this plot belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. How did the agency sworn to protect American citizens end up trying to destroy the moral conscience of a nation? The answer lies in a secret war that few dared to speak of. Until now, to understand the tragedy of 1964, we must first look back at the soil from which these two men grew. They were both sons of America, yet they lived in two entirely different worlds. One was built on the promise of a dream. The other was built on the fear of change. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't start as a monument. He was a boy born on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, a place where the church was the heartbeat of the community. He grew up in the shadow of Jim Crow, seeing his father, a proud preacher, refuse service at shoe stores and treated as a second-class citizen. These weren't just headlines to young Martin. They were the scars of his childhood. He saw the dignity in his father's eyes even when the world tried to blink it out. It was here, in the pews of Ebenezer Baptist Church, that he learned that words could be more powerful than fists. He didn't want to be a rebel. He wanted to be a scholar, a man of God who could bridge the gap between what America promised and what it actually delivered. But while Martin was learning to speak of love and justice, another man in Washington, D.C. was learning to master the art of secrets. Edgar Hoover was the architect of the modern FBI. For nearly half a century, he reigned over the Bureau with an iron fist. To Hoover, America was a delicate machine that only he knew how to keep running. He was a man of absolute order, a man who saw subversion in every shadow. By the time the civil rights movement began to stir in the 1950s, Hoover had already turned the FBI into a private intelligence empire. He didn't just want to catch bank robbers. He wanted to curate the moral fiber of the nation. In his mind, anyone who challenged the status quo was a threat to the soul of the country. The two worlds collided in 1955 during the Montgomery bus boycott. When a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. was thrust into the spotlight. He wasn't the first choice to lead, but he was the one who could turn a local protest into a national movement. As his voice echoed across the radios of America, it eventually reached the mahogany desk of Edgar Hoover. Hoover didn't see a man fighting for his people. He saw a communist agitator. He saw a black messiah who could lead a revolution that would tear down the walls Hoover had spent his life protecting. The FBI's obsession didn't start with a letter. It started with a file that began to grow thicker with every speech King gave. The Bureau began to follow him. At first, it was from a distance, noting who he talked to, where he traveled, and what books he read. But Hoover wanted more. He needed a way to discredit the man whose moral authority was beginning to eclipse the government's own power. The FBI found their excuse in King's association with Stanley Levison, a lawyer who had past ties to the Communist Party. For Hoover, this was the smoking gun. Under the guise of national security, he convinced Attorney General Robert Kennedy to authorize wiretaps on King's home and office. It was a fateful decision. With the stroke of a pen, the privacy of a nation's most prominent civil rights leader was handed over to a man who despised him. But the wiretaps didn't find a communist plot. They didn't find a secret army. Instead, they found a human being. They found King's late-night anxieties, his private jokes, and his moments of profound exhaustion. They also found his flaws. Hoover realized that if he couldn't prove King was a traitor to the country, he would prove he was a traitor to his marriage. This was the birth of the FBI's most sinister project. They stopped being investigators and started being voyeurs. They moved from the streets to the bedrooms. While the rest of the world saw a hero marching in the streets of Birmingham, the FBI was listening to the sound of his breathing in hotel rooms, waiting for a single moment of weakness they could use to crush him. The agency began to plant microphones in the headboards of King's beds. They followed him to every city, every church, every rally. Thousands of miles away from the protests, in the sterile offices of D.C., agents sat with headphones on, recording hours of private conversations. They weren't looking for crimes. They were looking for dirt. Hoover's hatred became personal. He was a man who lived a life of rigid, almost monastic discipline, and he was disgusted by the vibrancy and the humanity he heard on those tapes. He began to circulate memos within the Bureau, calling King the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country. As King's fame grew, so did the Bureau's desperation. They watched as he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and told the world he had a dream. To the millions watching, it was a moment of national healing. To J. Edgar Hoover, it was a declaration of war. The stage was set. The surveillance was total. The FBI had become a ghost that followed King everywhere he went, a silent, invisible predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They weren't just watching a leader. They were preparing to destroy a man's spirit. Long before they ever sent that package to his door, the summer of 1963, the momentum of the civil rights history was no longer a ripple. It was a tidal wave. At the center of this storm stood Martin Luther King Jr., a man who had become the moral compass of a fractured nation. This was his season of triumph. In August, more than 250,000 people gathered at the feet of the Lincoln Memorial, a sea of humanity united by a single dream. To the world watching on their flickering television sets, King was a prophet of peace. But to the man sitting in an office at the Department of Justice, he was a target that needed to be neutralized. Success, for King, was never about personal glory. It was about the weight of a movement that was finally breaking the back of segregation. In early 1964, the world watched as President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, a monumental victory that dismantled the legal architecture of white supremacy. King was invited to the White House, shook hands with the most powerful men in the world, and was hailed as a modern-day Moses. His influence had crossed the Atlantic, inspiring oppressed peoples from South Africa to Northern Ireland. However, as the light on King grew brighter, the FBI surveillance grew deeper and more invasive. J. Edgar Hoover was not impressed by the Nobel Peace Prize or the applause of the masses. In fact, the more the public loved King, the more Hoover hated him. To Hoover, the "I Have a Dream" speech was a provocation. Within days of that speech, the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division issued a memo stating that King was the most dangerous Negro in the future of the United States. The Bureau's strategy shifted from passive observation to active destruction. They didn't just want to know where he was. They wanted to know who he was behind closed doors. This period saw the escalation of the infamous Willard Hotel bugging. While Martin Luther King Jr. was preparing his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, words that would define the 20th century, FBI technicians were crawling through service ducts and hotel ceilings to plant microphones. They were listening for a slip of the tongue, a moment of anger, or an infidelity that could be used as a weapon. The contrast was staggering. In public, King was the recipient of a 1964 Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest man at the time to receive such an honor. He traveled to Oslo, standing in the Grand Hall of the Ola, draped in the dignity of a statesman. He spoke of a genuine brotherhood and a radiant star of peace. He was at the absolute peak of his global influence. Yet, even as he accepted the gold medal, the shadow of the FBI surveillance followed him across the ocean. Back in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover was holding press conferences, publicly calling King the most notorious liar in the country. It was an unprecedented attack by a government official on a private citizen. But Hoover wasn't just talking. He was planning. He felt the clock ticking. He knew that if he didn't act soon, King would be untouchable. The Bureau began to package the dirt they had gathered from those hotel rooms. They weren't looking for a legal trial. They were looking for a social execution. This was the era when the FBI suicide letter was first conceived in the mind of William Sullivan, Hoover's right-hand man. The FBI had collected hours of audio, recordings of King in his most private and vulnerable moments. They didn't just keep these tapes in a file. They curated them like a weapon of war. They saw the Nobel Prize not as a celebration of peace, but as an opportunity for a final, devastating blow. In the eyes of the American public, the mid-60s were the golden age of the civil rights history. The marches were working, the laws were changing, and the dream felt reachable. But for King, the air at the mountaintop was getting thin. He knew he was being followed. He could hear the clicks on his phone lines. He could feel the cold breath of the state on his neck. The man who had given hope to millions was secretly being suffocated by the very institutions meant to protect his freedom. The tension was reaching a breaking point. On one side stood the power of an idea whose time had come. On the other stood the raw, unchecked power of a secret police force determined to keep the old world alive. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a psychological siege. And as King prepared to return from Oslo to a hero's welcome in America, the FBI was preparing to deliver a package that would change the course of his life and the history of the nation forever. The package sat on the table like a dormant bomb. It was November 1964, just 34 days before Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to accept the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. For the FBI, the timing wasn't an accident. It was a calculated strike designed to maximize the terror. When Coretta Scott King opened that box, she found a reel of tape and a single, unsigned sheet of paper. What followed was perhaps the most shameful moment in the history of American law enforcement. The tape contained recordings, distorted, grainy, but unmistakable, of private conversations and intimate moments gathered from various hotel rooms across the country. But it was the accompanying letter that revealed the true depth of the J. Edgar Hoover obsession. Written by William Sullivan, the Bureau's domestic intelligence chief, the letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was written in a disguised voice, pretending to be a disillusioned follower of the movement. But the venom was pure FBI. The text didn't just criticize King. It sought to strip him of his humanity. It called him a filthy, abnormal animal and a colossal fraud. It mocked his Nobel Prize, claiming that the king the world admired was nothing more than a mask for a beastly reality. But the most chilling part was the conclusion. The letter issued a deadline. It told King that the filthy evidence on the tapes would be released to the public unless he took action. The final lines were a direct invitation to death. King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is? You are done. There is but one way out for you. The FBI's suicide letter was not a request for a confession. It was a command for self-destruction. When King heard the tapes and read those words, the weight of the entire federal government seemed to collapse onto his shoulders. This was the crisis. For a man who preached nonviolence and moral integrity, being confronted with his own human flaws by a predatory state was a soul-crushing experience. He wasn't just being watched. He was being hunted by a ghost that knew his every secret. King convened a small group of his most trusted advisors in a church basement. They listened to the tapes in a heavy, suffocating silence. They knew immediately who had sent it. The realization was terrifying. The same agency that was supposed to protect them from the KKK was now using the same tactics as the terrorists they were meant to fight. In that room, the atmosphere wasn't just one of fear, but of profound betrayal. They realized that in the eyes of the J. Edgar Hoover administration, a black man with a dream was more dangerous than a white man with a bomb. The psychological toll on Martin Luther King Jr. was immense. Those close to him noted a deepening of his natural melancholy. He began to live with the constant, gnawing knowledge that his every word, even those whispered in the dark, belonged to the Bureau. The FBI surveillance had succeeded in creating a digital panopticon around his life. He felt like a man walking on a thin sheet of ice, knowing that at any moment, Hoover could pull the lever and sink his reputation, his family, and the entire civil rights history. Yet, this crisis also revealed a different kind of strength. Despite the FBI's attempt to use his personal life to destroy his public mission, King refused to take the way out they offered. He didn't quit. He didn't hide. Instead, he chose to carry the burden of his imperfections while continuing to march towards Selma and beyond. But the damage was done. The relationship between the leaders of the movement and the federal government was forever poisoned. The FBI continued to follow him, continuing to record, continuing to leak stories to friendly journalists in an attempt to ruin him. They spent more resources trying to drive a Nobel laureate to suicide than they did investigating the actual murders of civil rights workers in the South. This was the SASUT, not a decline in King's character, but a decline in the integrity of the American state. As the mid-60s wore on, King became increasingly aware that his time was short. He began to speak more frequently about his own death, not as a surrender to the FBI's letter, but as a recognition of the price of the path he had chosen. The shadow of that letter followed him until the day he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. It was a reminder that in the land of the free, the price of a dream was often a life of total, unforgiving scrutiny. For years, the story of the FBI suicide letter remained a ghost, whispered about in the corridors of power, but hidden from the citizens it was meant to serve. The American public in the 1960s saw the FBI surveillance as a shield against communism, a necessary tool for national security. They believed J. Edgar Hoover was the ultimate guardian of law and order. But as the decades passed and the ink on the secret files began to dry, a different, much darker picture emerged. The first true cracks in the wall of silence appeared in 1975 during the Church Committee hearings. For the first time, the American people were forced to look into a mirror and see the distorted reflection of their own government. The testimony revealed that the Bureau hadn't just been catching criminals. It had been weaponizing the private lives of its own citizens. When the details of the campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. were finally read into the public record, it wasn't just a political scandal. It was a moral earthquake. Thousands of miles away, the international community watched in disbelief. To the rest of the world, King was the shining symbol of American democracy, the proof that the United States could overcome its original sin of slavery through peace and reason. When it was revealed that the American state had tried to drive a Nobel Peace Prize winner to his death, it shattered the illusion of American exceptionalism. The world realized that while the U.S. was preaching freedom abroad, it was practicing a cold, calculated tyranny at home. For many Americans, this story hits close to home because it isn't just about the past. It raises a question that still haunts us today. How much of our soul are we willing to trade for the feeling of being safe? The FBI surveillance of the 1960s was the grandfather of the digital monitoring we see in the 21st century. It serves as a chilling reminder that when power is left unchecked, it doesn't just watch. It attempts to control the very essence of who we are. This was not a training drill. This was real. And in the smoke of these revelations, the world watched as the hero of the civil rights history emerged even taller. The fact that Martin Luther King Jr. could lead a movement while carrying the weight of the J. Edgar Hoover machine on his back made his achievements seem almost superhuman. The American perspective on this event has shifted from denial to deep-seated reflection. We now understand that the greatest threat to a nation isn't always an outside enemy. Sometimes, it's the betrayal of its own values by those sworn to protect them. The silence after the sirens in 1968 was loud, but the silence of the FBI's files was even louder. It told a story of a government that feared a man's words more than it feared the violence of his enemies. Today, when we look at the legacy of the civil rights history, we don't just see the marches or the speeches. We see a man who was harassed, blackmailed, and pushed to the edge by his own country. And yet he never stopped believing in that country's potential. The world no longer remembers Hoover as a hero. He is remembered as a man who weaponized the state. But King? He remains the conscience of a nation that is still trying to live up to the dream he died for. The reel stops spinning, and the room falls into a heavy, final silence. In that quiet J, Edgar Hoover likely believed he had won. He believed that by weaponizing FBI surveillance, he could dismantle the man who dared to challenge the soul of America. He believed a single FBI suicide letter could end the civil rights history by shattering its most powerful voice. But history has a way of remembering the truth long after the whispers of the powerful have faded into the dust. Hoover passed away in 1972, leaving behind a legacy of paranoia and a bureau that had to be rebuilt from the wreckage of its own scandals. His name, once a symbol of law and order, became a cautionary tale of what happens when a government forgets who it serves. He built a monument to suspicion, and in the end, that monument became his own prison. Martin Luther King Jr., however, left behind something that could never be buried in a secret file or burned in a furnace. He didn't just leave us his speeches. He left us the blueprint for human courage. He showed us that a person's flaws do not disqualify them from greatness, and that true dignity doesn't need applause to survive. Some stories end without closure, but as we look back, we realize that the tapes and the letters were just noise. The dream was the only signal that mattered. He is no longer on the stage, but his voice still rings in the hearts of millions today. It reminds us that even when the state turns its eyes upon you, and even when you feel most alone, the truth remains a lighthouse. To anyone who's ever stood alone against a giant, we see you. Maybe you've been in a moment like this, not with government plots, but with betrayal or the weight of being misunderstood. If this story moved you, or if it reminds you of someone who stood their ground when the world was against them, please share their name or your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and we value the community we are building here. History isn't just about the past. It's about the posture we take in the present. Thank you for walking through this shadow with us. Until next time, keep the dream alive.